Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest UK in a Changing Europe Lunch Hour. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at UKICE. Today, we're going to be looking at the state of devolution across the UK, and there's lots to discuss. If you can cast your minds back to the start of 2023, Nicola Sturgeon was the mistress of all she surveyed, riding high in Holyrood. Mark Drakeford was a long-serving and quite widely respected First Minister of Wales. Stormont was in a state of suspended animation, and Gordon Brown had just produced a long report on the future of the Constitution for Keir Starmer. Roll on a year, and the First Minister of Scotland is no longer Nicola Sturgeon. It's Humza Yousaf after a near-run election with Kate Forbes, which he won by 52.1 to 47.9. You can do the roundings. And the SNP seems to be under real challenge from Scottish Labour. Mark Drakeford is in his last day in office, I think, after serving 5 years and meeting his commitment to leave, handing over to Vaughan Gething after an even closer contest with Jeremy Miles. Actually, yeah, is that closer? Yes, 51.7 to 48.3. Again, do the rounding, you get back to that fateful 52-48, which is the key number in any British election these days. The Northern Ireland Executive is back, and Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little-Pengelly have been spending last week in the US, along with Chris Heaton-Harris and Hilary Benn, and taking selfies with Joe Biden. So that's quite a big set of changes. But the Gordon Brown review, well, where is it? Sitting on a shelf somewhere. But we have had another constitutional review published because the Commission on the Future Constitution of Wales was published earlier this year, and that was chaired by Laura McAllister and Rowan Williams. So, great time to take stock of where we are on devolution across the UK, and I've got a terrific panel to help guide us all through it. First of all, I have Katy Hayward, Professor of Political Sociology in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work at Queen's University, Belfast. Second up, we have Thomas Horsley, Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Liverpool. Third, Nicola McEwen, Professor of Public Policy in the College of Social Sciences and Director of the Centre for Public Policy at the University of Glasgow. And last but by no means least, Jack Newman is Research Fellow at the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol, and has just this week, or in the last week, we were just discussing the precise timing, produced a report on the state of English devolution with the Bennett Institute. So remember how this works. Post your questions on Slido. Thanks for the ones that are coming in already, and vote for the ones that you want to force to the top of the list. Now, the panel don't know everything about devolution, so there may be some where they have to pass, but they know a lot more about devolution than almost anyone else in the country. So we're in for a brilliant upcoming hour. So let me kick off. Let's go first up north, up to Scotland. Nicola, Humza Yousaf's had a slightly rocky year in power. The SNP doesn't look quite the monolith that it once did. So how's he doing? What would be your assessment of how the government's going and the state of Scottish devolution at the moment?
So I think it's quite important to separate out those two things. So you're absolutely right that the SNP, in terms of its electoral strength, doesn't look quite as strong as it did even a couple of years ago. And it will be an interesting general election for them, and Labour clearly see an opportunity to come back in significant numbers within Scotland, and then subsequently the Holyrood elections are a couple of years later. But devolution, yes, the SNP is in government, but the devolved institutions, that's they're permanent institutions, right? So how is he doing as First Minister? Again, I think he didn't have the best start. He didn't have the best inheritance. Obviously, a very difficult political context in which to become leader. Very bruising electoral contest for leadership as well. And he hasn't really there are some positives that you can take, but there are some challenges too, and he hasn't yet managed to make his presence felt, I suppose, to overcome some of those earlier hurdles. Having said that, what we've seen, it was really interesting, is a separation of the sort of slight dip in support for the SNP. You're not seeing that in a dip in support for independence. So support for independence in opinion polls is remaining fairly solidly at somewhere between the 45 and 50% mark. And so it does look like the position that we ended up with in the 2014 independence referendum, where 45% voted yes, that's starting to look a bit more like a floor rather than a ceiling in support for independence. But that may change.
And Nicola, what's the SNP's current thinking on trying to force the independence issue? I think we saw, Nicola Sturgeon floating with using the general election to get a mandate for that. But now that the SNP looks, to be more competitive, or Scottish Labour looks more competitive with the SNP in the general election, where has the SNP landed now on its tactic to force a reluctant Westminster government to cede a legal referendum?
So I think it's a confusing policy. So Conference last year tried to arrive at a position that was quite difficult to understand, I think, but it was but I think there are different audiences that the party talks to when talking about these issues. There's the sort of the independence advocates audience that they are trying to keep on side and just, and make it clear that there is still momentum here. But then there's also a pragmatic thing. And I think there is a clear sense that you would need another mandate, although I don't think this has been officially said, you would need another electoral mandate for pursuing and going forward towards an independence referendum that would realistically secure a negotiated agreement like the Edinburgh Agreement from the UK government. To get to that point, you would need, you would need support for independence to be higher than it is right now. So there is no prospect at all for declaring independence or trying to pursue independence without that agreement. But how you get there, I think the SNP still has a challenge in that respect in terms of the route to independence.
And moving around the country, I'm going to stay with you, Nicola, here to Wales. We're seeing this sort of handover, a sort of very planned handover. Mark Drakeford actually meeting his commitment. I think people slightly surprised, saying politician does what he said he'd do. Bit of a shock in standing down. Is it going to make any difference to the rest of the UK that Vaughan Gething competed out Jeremy Miles? I think most people I've talked to said there wasn't much policy difference between the two of them. Does it make any difference? We're going to see a different style. Is that going to change the dynamic within the UK very much?
We might see a different style and a different relationship with the party at the UK level. Mark Drakeford had become quite a sort of, very strong home rule leader, very strong in his advocacy of Welsh devolution, very comfortable in joining forces with the SNP government in Scotland in their sort of desire to push back at some of the challenges to devolution that have been coming from the UK government over the last few years. And I think with Jeremy Miles, we might have seen more continuity in that respect. I'm not so sure with Vaughan Gething. I guess we'll have to see how things unfold. But in any case, if we are looking at a change of government at the UK level after the next general election, then that might have been trickier anyway, because you then have the same party in power in Wales and at the UK level. So it might be more difficult to have that more sort of combined forces of the devolved vis-a-vis it.
That's interesting. I think we'll come on to discuss, the implications of a change here. I'm quite intrigued that Vaughan Gething may sort of take it in a slightly different direction. We can explore that a bit more. But let's go to another part of the UK, Katy. It's, I think, 7 weeks since Stormont up and running, a new executive formed. You've got a four-party executive, she says, counting, is that right? The SLP as official opposition, and the DUP, I think, have put down quite an interesting motion that you were telling me you were just watching today. So how is Northern Ireland going? You all pleased to have a government back finally? And is it actually making headway with that massive intro of problems?
Yes, so by and large, the re-establishment of the Assembly was very much welcomed, and there was a sort of flurry of gestures which get a lot of attention in terms of, you know, our Sinn Féin First Minister attending events, standing for the British National Anthem, and the DUP Deputy First Minister playing a little bit of camogie. So all of this is sort of part of the course now. We're quite used to it. Gestures that they're getting used to working together. But of course, as you say, what we really want to see is something in real terms. One thing that was quite interesting in some of the most recent polling that we did in Queen's under the post-Brexit governance project was with regards to how long people expected this to last. So people's responses to the re-establishment of the institutions. And from this, we saw that only a third of respondents expect this Assembly to last its mandate, i.e. to 2027. So interestingly enough, the doubters tended to be in the centre. So those people that we generally rely on or expect to be a little bit more optimistic with respect to the functioning institutions are those who are most cautious in this instance, which is quite interesting. So everybody's kind of holding their breath. We're not going to take anything for granted. And what's happening today is actually a sign of why such caution is probably well placed. So as you mentioned, the DUP has tabled something called an applicability motion, which I will explain as simply as possible. So basically, if you recall the debate around the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, a big part of it was a democratic deficit. So when the UK and the EU made changes to the protocol with the Windsor Framework last year, they brought in something called the Stormont break, which was essentially to allow a vote in the Assembly over updates and amendments to EU law. That's one thing. When this came to the UK Parliament to put that into a statutory instrument to allow that, the UK government added something that hadn't been there in the Windsor Framework. So this was an initiative of the UK government, and this was the applicability motion. And what they said was, this isn't about updates and amendments to the EU law that applies in Northern Ireland. This is about new law that the EU wishes to see added. Now, in some cases, you can say that's totally within their right to do that. Because as it is at the moment, as it stood already, the UK government could veto any new law being added to the Windsor Framework. This applicability motion says, before the UK government can add anything to the Windsor Framework, could agree the EU would do that, there has to be cross-community consent in the Assembly in a vote. So this is the applicability motion. There are ways in which we can get the government could get around that. It could say you don't need that cross-community consent because of exceptional circumstances, or if there's no cross-community consent for that new law applying, then if the UK government judges it won't create a new regulatory border between Britain and Northern Ireland, then it can overrule. But essentially what we see today is the DUP taking the first opportunity to show that it is not fully endorsing the Windsor Framework or the protocol. And this is very important because for them, they know, again, according to our polling and what they will know themselves on the streets, is that strong unionists, by and large, the DUP supporters welcome them going back in, but they want to see some action, not just in relation to the waiting lists and the public service pay, also in relation to the Windsor Framework and the sea border. So the DUP have tabled this applicability motion. They will vote against it, which means there will be no cross-community consent for it. The new EU law, by the way, is on geographical indicators for craft and industrial products. I was watching the debate there. The DUP is struggling to sort of say exactly why this is of concern, but it's the principle of the thing, by and large. And happy to answer more technical details on it if people wish, but essentially this is what it's all about. It's saying we do not want new law to be added to the Windsor Framework. So hence you see this new Assembly and executive great to see it, but it will be dogged by the politicisation of the Windsor framework, not just about the technical matters of governance. You're on mute, Jill.
No, that's really, sorry. That's no, it's really interesting. So, and where are the Ulster Unionists on this? Are they with, and we assume that the TUV vote with the DUP come out against this. Is anyone talking about the merits of this? I saw that Matthew O'Toole, the opposition leader now in Stormont, was saying that actually he thought this was going to be a disadvantage to Northern Ireland not to align with the EU on this. I mean, is anyone breaking ranks and saying actually on merits we should do this, even though it is a piece of EU legislation on the unionist side? Is there any appeal?
That's a good question. No, I haven't seen. The Assembly chamber was fairly empty. I couldn't see the UUP. I hadn't come across what they'd said yet. I would expect them to vote against, but I'm not sure. Maybe they will abstain. It'll be an interesting indicator as to what they might do if the Stormont break vote was called on this. But yes, it's the principle of the thing. Interestingly, too, we know that soft unionists, so UUP supporters generally, have been the ones who've moved over time, post-Windsor framework, the adjustments made last year, to be much more supportive of these arrangements. So majority of them kind of accept the arrangements and really want to see the Assembly getting on and doing the day-to-day business. So they'll be most cautious about sort of these gesture politics around the Windsor framework. So yes, it'll be interesting to see how they vote today.
Okay, and how about on the rest of things? I mean, is this government, do you share the pessimism of your interviewees about how long the executive might last?
Yes, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but definitely cautious, because I think we've been saying for a long time these arrangements are they're very tricky. So even if you took out the politics of it all, I remember you and I talking about this, Jill, years ago when you were over in Belfast years ago, saying even if you had if it was the Scottish Parliament or the Senate having to deal with it, it would be tricky. But you add in the politics and it makes it all the more difficult. And also got a good number of new MLAs who are just finding their feet. And of course, with all the friskiness around the upcoming election, that too adds to people's sense of drama and uncertainty here. And the fact that the TUV, the traditional unionist voice, who only have one MLA, but they announced this weekend about having an agreement with Reform UK. Again, that changes the dynamics somewhat. And it means that the DUP thinks that threat from the strong unionist hardline wing is perhaps more vivid than it might otherwise be. So yes, all of the sort of the UK-wide dynamics and general uncertainty that we see in political scene is sort of exacerbating that uncertainty here as well.
Okay, well, I'm going to continue our tour around. Jack, you've been looking at the sort of state of English devolution. Obviously, that's even more of a work in progress than devolution to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Where are we? And actually, we've got mayoral elections coming up. Anything interesting to watch out from there? But we've got sort of trailblazer deals with some big authorities. And we have a sort of debate about where does English devolution go next. So what happens next on English devolution? And should we regard it now as pretty well entrenched in the places that have adopted the mayoral model?
Yeah, thanks, Jill. First thing to caveat, obviously, is that English devolution doesn't quite mean the same thing as devolution elsewhere. There are no parliaments with kind of tax raising powers or anything like that. English devolution is instead a set of bilateral deals done with central government for a set of powers and funding to be handed to mayors in mostly city regions. So it's a very different beast, and it rolls out in a very kind of haphazard and ad hoc way. Where are we at the moment? So there actually seems to be something of a consensus emerging between the two main parties. So going back to 2022, which seems a long time ago in politics now, the Levelling Up white paper of the government and the Gordon Brown review of the Constitution both put forward quite ambitious kind of signals about devolving power in England. and both are relatively similar in the view that kind of continuing this rollout of devolution deals, combined authorities, metro mayors is the way forward. And there's been a slow kind of systematizing and deepening of that process, with Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester, Andy Street in the West Midlands getting gradually more powers and increasing flexibility over their funding as well. And we have a set of elections in May, so 8 mayors are up for election. Some of them are brand new ones. The East Midlands and the North East, 2 large areas that include multiple cities and a kind of new important steps in English devolution. But then probably just to say, underpinning this is a set of major problems with how the whole system is functioning at the moment that are not getting enough attention really from either of the political parties. So you mentioned our report. I'll get my plug in early. We released a report yesterday on accountability in English devolution with the Productivity Institute, and we focus on the extent to which too many of these mayoral authorities are having to answer up to Whitehall rather than kind of facing internal scrutiny or responding to local voters. And there are big problems in the way accountability functions in the system as a whole. Funding is obviously another massive challenge. Local authorities are going bust in increasing speed, and there's just a wide recognition that people spend most of their time firefighting crises rather than actually developing long-term strategies for the future. And then just one final thought, which is thinking a bit about what might be ahead. So if there is a Labour government later this year, they seem to have signalled that they'll continue the process of devolution, but there's very little detail on what that's going to entail. And yet their whole mission-driven government approach seems to rely significantly on there being strong regional and local delivery capacity in England. And yeah, we're yet to see what their plan is to deliver that. You're muted, Jill, again.
Sorry, I don't usually mute myself, but I'm having coughing fits, which is why I'm muting myself. So, so apologies to everybody for dopey, unlearned behaviour. Do we regard the Brown Review as the sort of blueprint for a Starmer government, or, well, thanks very much, Gordon, but we've sort of moved on? Where should we be taking that seriously and digging that out in the run-up to the election, or what do you reckon, Jack?
Yeah, I mean, that remains to be seen, but yeah, some speculation. So the Brown Review was really ambitious, at least in its language. I mean, it talks about replacing the House of Lords with a Senate of the Nations and Regions. It talks about the biggest transfer of power ever downwards in England and across the UK. And it talked about double devolution and real power to the kind of neighbourhood level as well. And I think the kind of scale of the language there will be unrealised, but there are some ideas there that may continue. I mean, one of the perhaps concern for those who advocate stronger devolution in England is this was Lisa Nandy's brief until last year, and she'd written a book on this. This was her thing, and she was moved. Angela Rayner was brought in, who, okay, as deputy leader, perhaps has a more powerful position in the party, but she has other priorities. She has a whole kind of programme on the future of work, and there's obviously the housing issue, which it seems Labour are going to play quite big at the general election. So English devolution seems to be slipping down the list, and there's not a great deal of indication that there'll be any major changes. I would be very shocked if they undertook House of Lords reform in the first term, for example. But then, like I said before, if they want to deliver mission-driven government where the centre sets this big strategy and other institutions need to go away and actually do the delivery, then they're going to need strong local and regional institutions in England. If they want to pursue growth and develop an industrial strategy, they're going to need these strong regional institutions. And all the literature points to the economic kind of justifications of having these institutions. And then one final thought is in relation to, so on the current project I'm working on, the Trude project, we're looking at public health in urban development. And Labour have this big agenda on preventative health. And if you want to make cities healthier places to live with less car dependence and healthier homes, etc., then you need to have the local and regional institutions capable of delivering those kinds of policies.
Okay, so interesting. We'll watch this space. We're going to come back on where we are on the Welsh Constitutional Commission as well. But Thomas, you look at the sort of relations between all these places. We've got a question here from Anonymous, which it's got quite a lot of votes for a question about the internal market legislation. So Anonymous is asking, what's the future of devolution in the shadow of the UK internal market legislation? So that was much resented, I think, across the devolved nations. And we've got new intergovernmental relations machinery. How are the constituent parts, England, UK, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, how are they relating to other? Do we have functioning machinery now? And how are all these new frameworks and things working out?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot to unpack there. I think the passage of the act you mentioned, the Internal Market Act, was probably maybe not the lowest point, but it's certainly been a very low point in intergovernmental relations, where effectively the UK government at the time under Boris Johnson imposed on the devolved institutions a sort of market regulatory structure. And the whole idea is that behind it is to manage the diversity in regulations that inevitably arise following our departure from the EU. And it's a really powerful piece of legislation, and it has already had quite a lot of impact both in Wales and in Scotland. And it's a piece of legislation that has effectively bounced the administrations both in Scotland and in Cardiff, Edinburgh and Cardiff, into changing their policies, because in a sense, it limits the practical effect of the policies in devolved areas, particularly in areas such as environmental protection, single-use plastics, all these things. It sits alongside another framework which pre-exists, and the relationship between those two isn't entirely clear. And the devolved administrations themselves take different approaches to the application of the Act. I think it's something that is likely to be adjusted. There's certainly scope for adjustment if there were to be a change of government. But on a more positive note, we have seen, you mentioned some intergovernmental relations issues. We have seen some reforms. There was a review, of course, of intergovernmental relations, and that has led to the introduction of new structures and the move towards creating something that is a little bit more has a little bit more of independence from Whitehall, or the sense that there's a little bit more moving away from Whitehall control of the whole process and dispute resolution. But it's still very much quite marginal. I think the Act is there, the principles are there, and it's still having quite a significant impact on those issues. So it's certainly something that is causing friction in devolution, and it's an issue that will have to be, I think, revisited as we move forward.
Katy, there's a sort of new bit of intergovernmental machinery that was promised in safeguarding the Union, the East-West Council. Do you or Thomas like to tell us what that is and whether that's an important addition, or is that just a sort of gesture to the DUP? Thomas, do you want to kick off, and then we'll get Katy's reaction from Belfast?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things I would stress, if we put that in a broader context, obviously the Northern Ireland situation, and Katy will talk to that much more authoritatively than I will. But I think one of the things that comes out of, if we step back from all these individual developments that have been happening, is that the Brexit process, but beyond the Brexit process, and including what's happening in England at the moment, is really exposing the fact that there is this massive gap or failure in connecting up the various different parts. And I think one of the things, if we were to think about the big challenges of devolution going forward, is very much about trying to link things together to create a purpose, to create a renewed understanding of what devolution is about, what it's for. And the Brown Report links that to economic growth, for example, which is one strategy. But certainly, the individual reforms to particular institutions happening in Wales, for example, the number of members is increasing from 60 to 96. So there's a lot of constitutional reform in Wales, not just in Northern Ireland and Scotland and England, but it's joining the things together. And the intergovernmental framework at the moment has its kind of weaknesses. It is a bit of a fair weather system, and it's built on trust and investment of all the parties politically in its effective functioning. And I think that's been under strain. So these new mechanisms, new proposals, I think are to be welcomed. And I think that's the landscape that we're going to be entering into, where the reforms need to be. In short, it's less about, with the exception of England, perhaps, it's less about powers and competences. It's more, I think, about making the system work and connecting things together. I think that's one of the bigger challenges for devolution going forward.
So, Katy, is the East West Council an important new bit, or is it going to meet once and then be forgotten about?
Well, I know it's due to meet a week today, actually, in Belfast. It'll involve elected representatives from Westminster and Stormont, and then the idea is that it will expand out to include business and educational institutions and various stakeholders. It's quite ambitious. And underneath that is meant to be something called Intertrade UK, which coincidentally mirrors Intertrade Ireland, which was founded in 1998. But Intertrade UK is meant to enable all parts of the UK to benefit from, to maximise the UK internal market. But it was, as Thomas says, this was derived for sort of in response to GP concerns especially, and not in close collaboration or negotiation with the other parts of the UK, let alone with other parties in Northern Ireland to any significant degree. So I couldn't agree more with Thomas. The questions as to how these various bodies meet and fit together and don't contradict each other or complement the work of the others is all important. And oftentimes you sort of wonder whether, when some initiative has been shown to reassure about the union being safeguarded, whether that's done with awareness or cognizance of the existence of other relevant elements of law or of structures that whether it's done with a cognizance of that at all, let alone a consideration of how it all fits together.
And Nicola, I'm going to come on to the questions in a second, but where did the Welsh constitutional, because they looked at sort of different models, didn't they, for the future of the UK? Any likelihood of traction for any of them? Because I think they thought the current system was a bit unsustainable, didn't they? Or have I misunderstood what they were saying?
Yeah, no, so they specifically didn't make a recommendation for a particular model. They didn't think that was their place, but they were very critical of the way that devolution has evolved, particularly within the context of Brexit, and pointing to things like the UK Internal Market Act, like the way that the Sewell Convention has lost some of its authority by being, well, essentially ignored when consent is withheld. And that none of that happened before Brexit, but it's happened not particularly frequently, but it's happened on a number of occasions to kind of lose the power of the Sewell Convention. And so they thought it was important to address that. And actually, one of the recommendations, although it didn't use this word, it sort of seemed to suggest almost like a veto over Westminster legislation that would affect devolution and devolved powers if it didn't have the consent of the devolved institutions. They also talked about, going back to the intergovernmental relations discussion, they also talked about a duty to cooperate, which I couldn't quite get my head around how that would work. And I think you can have a duty to engage. You can put intergovernmental relations in statute, which it is not at the moment, and it is in some other countries. But you can't have a legislative duty for them all to get along and be nice to each other. That's a whole other challenge. But I absolutely agree with Thomas and Katy that this is all becoming very incoherent, and there are all sorts of new bodies, new processes that and we've talked about the new intergovernmental machinery, but that doesn't obviously have a role in overseeing the operation of the UK Internal Market Act or in overseeing common frameworks. So, which is another thing that emerged post-Brexit. So it's all very messy and incoherent. Where I would maybe sort of have a slightly different view is that I think it is about powers, not necessarily in terms of changing powers, but in how the powers can effectively operate. So there's certainly some evidence to suggest that the UK Internal Market Act has constrained the effectiveness and the reach of devolved powers in some areas. It's interesting that Katy was saying about the trade, intertrade, UK being part of the East-West Council relationship and shadowing that, because what UKIM tells us is that there is a priority given to trade mobility across the UK over regulatory autonomy, or over the autonomy of the devolved institutions to go in a different direction. And that's an ideological choice that has prioritised one thing over another thing. Whether that changes, I think there will be some changes if there is a Labour government. I don't expect there to be much changes to the UKIM legislation, but there's potential to change the way it operates and to make it less competitive and to have a more collegiate process to what was a challenge that everybody recognised after the UK left the EU.
Thomas, you were nodding. Do you agree with Nicola that that's likely to be a development?
I think so. I think if we look at the operation of the Act over time, both in the I'm talking mainly about Wales and Scotland. If we look at there, we do see as entirely, as Nicola summarises beautifully, we see the practical effects of, it's almost a chilling effect is perhaps the easiest way to express it. It's having a chilling effect. So to take one example from Scotland, we had the SNP launching its deposit return scheme, so part of the circular economy drive, and effectively it had to shelve that plan because it realised it would be unable to include particular products, glass here, into its scheme. And, significant financial investment went into that scheme, significant, adjustments had already been made. It was a big flagship policy, and all of a sudden it was sort of paused. And it was paused because there was a realisation that the operation of the Internal Market Act would mean that the Scottish Government would be unable to prevent glass products entering from elsewhere in the UK. And, England's the largest economic market. Of course, things are going to come in there. So I think the real practical effect around the Internal Market Act is really, really serious. But I do agree with Nicola. I think looking at the Act, I don't see, and looking at what I'm hearing from Labour and picking up, if it is going to come into power, I don't see this being a priority in terms of completely changing the Act, reviewing, certainly not repealing it, I don't even think, because something needs to be there. Where I do agree with Nicola, and where I think we will head, is there will be an adjustment, there'll be a softening, there'll be a reintroduction of some of the principles with which we're familiar when we were members of the EU, such as the proportionality principle, adding extra grounds for policy innovation around environmental protection, consumer protection, etc. So making it less neoliberal, if we put it in a sort of summer. And that, of course, will help to reboost and reignite one of the key things about devolution, which is regulatory experimentation, innovation, and sort of diversity, if you like.
Okay, I'm now going to go to the questions. So I'm going to go to some of the questions. So the top ranked questions from Paul Evans. And interested, anyone who wants to comment on this, how can we get the elected members of devolved and undevolved legislatures, I think he means the UK Parliament, but I don't know what else he means by that, but whatever, Commons and Lords, to talk to each other and understand each other better. And I'm going to link that to another question about people from Gavin Brown, who says, no major UK party has influential Scots or Welsh MPs among their leadership. Slightly tempted to add discuss, but is that true? There is an absence of politics for the devolved nations, Westminster. Is that a concern? So, how, I think, do we raise a bit of Devo consciousness? Is that going to be an issue with a new government? Katy, any thoughts about that? Obviously, Northern Ireland has different political parties, some of whom don't even take their seats at Westminster. And we've had problems with sort of voice, but are we worried about the lack of Devo awareness in Parliament, lack of contact?
Yes, certainly. And it's not just in Westminster, Whitehall as well, I think it's safe to say. Now, there are some mechanisms like the Interparliamentary Forum, which the various devolves participate in with Westminster, and they report back to their to the Assembly and the Parliaments on what goes on in that forum. So I think that's useful initiative. And we also have the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly as well, of course. It links in the Irish connection there too. So these things sort of exist, but again, it goes back to the British Irish Council, but it goes back to the point of communication about it. And I think sometimes you tend to have the same people involved in these various different initiatives. And now, of course, we have the UK EU level as well with the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly. So yes, it's because it's that much more complicated now, and particularly when relations are strained, these things are more important. It's that overall mapping of how all of this fits together and the overall purpose, which I think is yeah, it's sort of a good point to sort of reassess it all, and one would hope after the election that would take place as a fairly urgent priority.
And Nicola, what do you think? Obviously, we've gone through a long period of very few Scottish Labour MPs, so that might change potentially on current polling. And we've got a question here from Carol Hayden, who's asking about tensions between the position Scottish Labour is adopting on some issues like Gaza, gender identity, with the National Party. I think you were talking a bit about the Gething/Miles potential relationship with Keir Starmer, but is that going to be a tricky relationship going forward?
I don't see it as a tricky relationship at the moment anyway. I mean, I think so after you get the next general election, all eyes then are on the devolved elections, and the Labour Party in Scotland clearly see an opportunity there, the first in a while, and it will be important for them to be able to present themselves as distinctive. And I think there's almost a permissive strategy at the UK party to enable that. And I suppose that's been a bit easier, actually, when going back to your previous question about when there haven't been dominant Scottish figures in the UK party. It was a bit harder to diverge when you had, some of the most powerful figures in UK Labour were Scottish MPs. And so it may well be that you start to see that build again at the UK level. I don't think it'll be anything like the dominance that Scottish Labour had over UK Labour before in the Gordon Brown era. But I think that having divergent positions doesn't necessarily create tension. It can be that, for pragmatic and political reasons, it's okay that parties can live with that. And I think that is the absence. One of your questioners said, is the absence of dominant figures at the centre a concern? I think it's only a concern if that's the only way they can understand the UK. But I think it's incumbent on any party operating in Westminster, if they want to understand the country that they are seeking to govern, then maybe they should understand it beyond SW1.
Jack, sorry, just caught it. Jack, we saw some tensions between Keir Starmer and Sadiq Khan in the wake of the Uxbridge by-election. People like Andy Burnham have higher name recognition than most of the cabinet. Are we building up sort of big multipolar government that's potentially going to be tense if it changes the power? And we've seen Andy Street denouncing, or at least expressing reservations about HS2. I'm quite interested in that. And I want to link that to another question for you from Billy Davis, who's asking about sort of some of the pan-regional partnerships like the Northern Powerhouse and Western Gateway. Are those going to be important players in the future of devolution? So going even beyond the combined authorities, where do you see them fitting in?
Yeah, thanks. So I think the question about the politics of Labour mayors is a very interesting one, and obviously you've had Andy Burnham speaking out in very differently to what Keir Starmer's been saying on a number of issues. Andy Burnham's been championing rewiring the constitution and things like this, which have been at odds with what the Central Party have been saying. I think Labour have, to some extent, seen this problem coming, and through work that Sue Gray's done, they've started to build better relations with their mayors. But I think there's still a challenge for them there. They've got this new unknown beast, which is a load of Labour mayors that have quite a powerful voice and speak quite clearly for parts of the country that have become very politically important. The big cities of the north and their Labour strongholds. And I think this is going to create tensions, especially if Labour row back on some of its kind of rhetoric on English devolution and don't kind of start handing down the funding and powers that these areas need. So that could be a thorn in a future Labour government's side, potentially. Sorry, did you want to jump in? I was going to go on to the pan-regional question. Yeah, on the pan-regional question, there is interest in the Labour Party about bigger regions. There always has been. There always has been a strand of the Labour Party that wants to see England as 4, 5 or 9 regions that it can neatly divide up and be a step towards a more federalised system in the UK. So I think there's always been that tendency. But then there's also a recognition that some of these larger regions are probably necessary for things like dealing with intercity transport and dealing with some of the big infrastructure questions. And you already have something of a blueprint of those in the kind of legacy of the Northern Powerhouse and things like that. So yeah, I think pan-regional partnerships will become more important under a Labour government. And very briefly, just to say, I'd like to add to the thoughts of the other panelists on this idea of there needing to be more systematization of the way that intergovernmental relations work in the UK. And England is a kind of a big problem for this, because the UK government acts as the government for England and the government for the UK at the same time, which completely destabilizes its relations with the devolved nations and problematizes that relationship as well. So if you can get the mayors of England as somebody speaking for England, then potentially that can start to balance that relationship more effectively.
Thomas, do you think it's feasible to graft the mayors into... I mean, the mayors mean a lot of the country is unrepresented. There's sort of people who don't live in the big urban conurbations and things like that. But is there a way of grafting English local government in to make it a less unbalanced set of intergovernmental relations, or is that?
I think there's definitely an argument for bringing in people, because we're dealing here with, overlapping issues, interactions, issues of managing diversity and change. And I think it's really important. There's definitely a role to bring in people, decision makers, into these areas for sort of more joined up thinking. And I also think, going back to the sort of connectivity point, I think, you mentioned a really nice phrase. You said, Devo consciousness. And I think it's quite difficult for citizens to get their head around things if things aren't logically connected and there isn't this sort of sense of structures and purpose, which sort of joins everything up together. So I think part of this sort of solution is to think more about how the structures we have, because I think panelists have already mentioned, we've had talk of intergovernmental relations in terms of parliamentary forums, British Irish councils, we've got the Office for the Internal Market now, we've got all of these little things. And I think bringing things together is really important. And there's certainly a role for bringing in localized and regional mayoral decision makers into these new structures.
Okay. Can I just jump in there? I mean, I absolutely agree with the problem. So there is a need to have some sort of vehicle for bringing in voices from the English regions. But I think if you were to bring them in to the forums that are structured around devolution for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, you will address one problem and very quickly create another, because the perception and I think this is a problem when we talk about devolution in England and we talk about devolution in Scotland, and they mean very different things. To lump them together, in a sense, diminishes the status of devolution in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. That may well be part of the political objective for some, but that is politically problematic for others.
That's quite interesting. I used to always call it devolution, meaning Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and decentralisation in England as something very clearly different, but maybe we need to go back to that language. Okay, Jack mentioned the F word, funding, which is a constant source of problems. Paul Carmichael has asked, with financial deals cut for Wales and Northern Ireland, where does this leave the Barnett formula? Is it time for a new needs-based evaluation exercise, allocation mechanism Katy, Northern Ireland got a massive financial settlement as the price for going back in. So we can regard funding in Northern Ireland as sorted, can't we?
Interestingly, I received the newsletter from the Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Associations, and their headline this morning is a complaint about sort of a deft of hand move by the British government to take money away that had already been allocated that would benefit community organisations on the ground with respect to those in long-term unemployment, and then to move that as part of the package to persuade the DUP back into power sharing. Which sort of is just an illustration of how murky all this is, and how the bringing in of financial packages to persuade people elected to take up their responsibility to govern, and to meet the very real needs that exist in communities, most particularly in Northern Ireland, with its current crisis in public service delivery. One of the first things that the new executive did or agreed upon was a letter to the Treasury to ask for more money. And we know that they've not yet agreed on the programme for government, and then the long-term spending or long-term revenue raising in particular, which is what the British government is looking to see. So all of this comes in that bigger question that Paul raises about the Barnett formula and how all this works. And I think increasingly it seems to be the case that that there is consensus there's a need to look at this again in light of the current state of the Union.
And Nicola, where are Scotland and Wales on Barnett at the moment, and how much are they actually using their tax raising powers, which they have? Northern Ireland doesn't have that much, but they do, and we now see quite a different income tax structure in Scotland emerging. Yeah,
so it's another one of those complexities of devolution that wasn't there before, and divergences too. So the tax powers are more significant in Scotland than they are in Wales. They don't have a choice but to use them. They have to use them as an obligation to raise tax. Where the power lies is the ability to adjust, and there's greater ability to adjust within Scotland, and you now have quite a distinctive tax structure in Scotland than you do in the rest of the UK, such that if you live in Scotland, you are paying more by and large, unless you're sort of at the lower end, but certainly from the middle and upper end, you're paying more. But of course you get more, and these are political choices. But it complicates the operation of the Barnett formula. The Barnett formula is used to adjust the block grant, and then further down the line, you then have what are called block grant adjustments to adjust for what was decided in terms of the tax powers. So again, it's all very complicated. I mean, I think to go back to your original question about the Barnett formula and whether there ought to be a needs-based thing, I mean, I think in one sense, it seems a bit bonkers to decide your spending allocations to Scotland and Wales based on what you decide is important for England, which is essentially how the Barnett formula operates right now. The problem is, if you do move towards something that decides on the basis of allocation of need, there's an awful lot of politics in deciding how we define need and the criteria for need. And, you know, that would be interesting. You know, maybe it is something that we ought to do, but it probably, again, is another one of these things that could have unintended difficult consequences.
And Jack, where are we on funding for the English, maybe the big new devolved authorities, fiscal? I mean, they keep on saying they need more fiscal autonomy. Any prospect of that, or need to move to needs-based allocations? Any prospect of that?
Yeah, I mean, just to start with, to say that I think it's widely recognised that the current funding system is broken in England. Local authorities don't get enough money, and then they end up scrambling around for these small competitive pots to do very minor things that central government have decided is important. So there's a consensus on what's wrong, but I think then there is a disagreement about what the solutions are. So on the one hand, you've got one solution is fiscal devolution, and I suppose this applies in the devolved nations as well, as you hand down a load more tax raising powers And to some extent, central government kind of wipes its hands with a lot of policy making that goes on and says, you've got the tax raising powers, you deal with it. It solves some of those accountability problems at the same time. There are big concerns about fiscal devolution for me, not least if you do it on a kind of large scale, then you're going to end up with the richest areas being able to provide the best services where they're least needed. But then if you look at the other kind of possible solution other than devolving tax raising powers is to develop some sort of formula that applies to England that distributes money. We already have this to some extent with the way in which money is distributed to local authorities, but it's very patchy and as I say, insufficient. If you were to move towards some sort of long-term needs-based formula, that in theory sounds like a great idea that seems to solve a lot of these problems. You have, however, one concern that is central government still ultimately accountable for the money, and therefore will it want to stay in control of a lot of what happens? And B, I think the bigger challenge that Nicola raised is, how do you write the formula? How do you decide what's in it? How do you decide on need? And then there's potentially a big political problem for some in the sense that is it going to areas that are politically useful for whoever's deciding the formula, and you get back to accusations of pork barrel politics, which I think have quite fairly been levelled at lots of the levelling up agenda money.
Okay, I want to come to, we've got 4 minutes left, there are 4 of you, so we've got lots of questions coming in about whether the UK government's attitudes made Scottish independence inevitable, whether Brexit's made a border poll in Northern Ireland inevitable. Feel free to pick those up. But Cravar Petcar has asked what wider constitutional reforms might better safeguard, assuming you want them safeguarded, the devolution settlements for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and which are realistic. So if you had to make one sort of big constitutional recommendation to an incoming government of any persuasion, if they wanted to sort of keep the UK together, what would it be, and to make the thing function better? And then maybe everybody could comment on whether their own bits are going to go their own way. Jack, you don't have to comment about whether Manchester is going to declare UDI or Bristol's going to go off. But Thomas, you looking at all these things, what would be your constitutional proposition for the next Parliament?
I mean, there's a lot of things, constitutional protections. We've mentioned the Brown reforms around potentially second chamber, giving it powers to enforce the Sewell Convention more effectively. I'm a little bit skeptical about legalizing things necessarily, and certainly skeptical about bringing courts. I actually think that the current system, it's not perfect, but the IGR structures, although we have been criticizing them, a lot of it could work if there was a reinvestment, particularly from London, Westminster, in devolution as a process. And it's sort of investment politically making it want to work, because I think relationships IGR can work, but it does require the actors to buy into the system and treat each other with respect and rebuild trust. So perhaps there is scope without radical change to improve post-election. So that would be my low-hanging fruit.
Okay, Katy, what would you do to?
I think just to answer the border poll question, we certainly see from Life and Times survey growing expectation of Irish unification, but that's really connected to the fact of not having functioning devolution, and the Safeguarding the Union command paper prioritised trying to reassure unionists in relation to that. But of course, we know that stability and functioning devolution in Northern Ireland is always about a balance. And now that balance is not just between the British and Irish relationship, but also the UK-EU relationship. So I would say that the future of the union, if you're wanting to secure it, is first and foremost, you need to get a closer, better relationship with the EU.
Okay, close, better relationship with the EU. Jack, what would you do to entrench or to develop further?
Yeah, there's all sorts of things that you could do to try and entrench English devolution, putting some more of it in legislation for a start, and giving local leaders some sort of say at the centre. But I think the big issue for me is that what we think of as a ratchet in English devolution, the extent to which powers are devolved and then not taken back. If we want to keep that ratchet going, the crucial aspect is for the public to be invested in it. So I think there needs to be a strategy for rebuilding public understanding and engagement in local democracy, local mayors, which doesn't sound very constitutional, but I think that is ultimately the constitutional protection for mayors in England, is that the public are invested, engaged, participating. So I think that should be the focus.
And final word, Nicola.
The Sewell Convention. I think it's really, really important if you want to safeguard devolution and restore the authority of the devolved institutions, that there is some work to do to strengthen the effect of the Sewell Convention, and that the Constitutional Commission on the Future of Wales came forward with some practical suggestions as to how we might do that. I think I would encourage an incoming government to look at those seriously. Because I think although you might think it's a convention, it doesn't really matter, but actually it was, I think, a really important symbol of the status and authority of the devolved institutions within the UK. And just, if I can make one final point, what we've seen since for ages, up until 2016, if you measured opinion in Scotland, devolution in a three-way split was clearly the favoured option, not anymore. So there has been a sort of loss of confidence in devolution within Scotland, that if you're a party that's seeking to continue the UK, you might want to be cognizant of.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you all very much. And thank you very much for all your fantastic questions. And I'm sorry if I didn't get to your questions. I think we picked up quite a lot of the themes, but I know some people will be thinking, why didn't they get to that? But there were an awful lot of questions. So thanks very much to Jack, Thomas, Katy, and Nicola, and see you at the next UK and Changing Europe Lunch Hour. And meanwhile, do check out our report published last week, which does look at devolution among lots of other things, on how far the UK state has adapted to Brexit. And the answer is, it's far from done yet, whatever you might have thought you were voting for in 2019. Anyway, see you all soon. Thanks so much for my panel, and bye.